The day value vanished. What if money didn't crash? It simply vanished. Berlin, 1923. A man walks into a bakery pushing a wheelbarrow full of banknotes. By the time he reaches the counter, the price of bread has doubled. He leaves the cash, but takes the wheelbarrow. The metal is worth more than the paper it carried. When money dies, there's no explosion, no fire, no sirens, just silence. Value fades quietly, like paint under rain. People still go to work, still wait for payday, until one morning they realize the thing they trusted most has betrayed them. In Weimar Germany, hyperinflation erased lifetimes of savings with brutal speed, for some in weeks, for most within months. But this story isn't just German, it's Roman, it's Zimbabwean, it's Venezuelan, and maybe, someday, it's ours. Because every empire that prints more promises than it can keep ends the same way, not with poverty, but with disbelief. If you value truth over comfort, hit like, and remember this sound. Rome's forgotten lesson. Long before paper money, Rome minted trust in silver. Bright coins, denarii, each one stamped with Caesar's face and a silent promise. This is worth what it says. But centuries of war and pride changed that. Nero clipped the edges. The Severan emperors diluted the silver again and again, 78%, 60%, 40%. By the 3rd century, the shine was gone. What began as reform turned into erosion. Bread that once cost a single denarius now demanded hundreds. Not hyperinflation, but a slow-motion decay that hollowed the empire from within. Rome had no central bank, no money printers. It had soldiers and debts. So it debased the coinage to pay for wars, telling the people nothing has changed. But something had. Every clipped coin was a theft from the future. Every diluted denarius whispered that trust was expendable. Rome fell for many reasons: plague, borders, ambition, but few forces corroded it from within like the quiet betrayal of its own money. And when confidence died, the army followed. Because you can't mint loyalty. You can only earn it. And we still haven't paid that bill. The Weimar Inferno. 16 centuries later, the same story played again. Different language, same math. Germany, 1920s. The war was lost, but the debt survived. So the government did what every desperate empire does. It printed faith and called it recovery. Within months, wages doubled daily. Prices tripled before lunch. Children played with stacks of bills. Families burned cash for heat. By November 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. And yet, the people kept believing, until belief itself became unbearable. That's when extremism enters, offering simpler stories. The printing press didn't create a dictator, but it created the chaos that made one imaginable. In Munich, 1923, a failed coup whispered what a decade later would roar. Stabilization came with the Rentenmark, but the trauma stayed. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, that buried fear resurfaced and found a flag. Because when trust collapses once, the memory never leaves. The death spiral of confidence. Economies don't collapse because numbers fail. They collapse because belief does. Money isn't gold. It isn't paper. It isn't pixels. It's a story we agree to tell together. But what happens when the storyteller lies? Confidence becomes credit. Credit becomes debt. Debt becomes denial. Look around. Even as central banks raise rates, debt still grows faster than trust. Balance sheets expand, promises compound, 35 trillion in Washington and counting. They say, it's under control. That's exactly what Rome said. That's what Weimar said. That's what every empire says, right before the silence. So ask yourself, what's your money really worth when the story ends? The Modern Echo, 2008. The global system nearly ran out of oxygen, not air, but credit. Banks collapsed not because they ran out of money, but because money itself had lost definition. The fix, liquidity, they called it quantitative easing. It sounded technical, and it worked for a time. Markets rose, banks breathed, and policymakers declared victory. But every rescue writes a debt into the future. QE prevented collapse, yet planted a different seed: faith in central banks over productivity, in numbers over effort, in comfort over consequence. Since then, global debt has crossed $300 trillion. For every dollar of growth, 4 new dollars of obligation. Rome took centuries to fall. Weimar, a decade. We now live in an age of algorithms, where shocks travel in milliseconds, but legitimacy still unravels over years. And somewhere in that quiet gap between panic and denial, the story starts again. If this cycle feels familiar, share it. History doesn't repeat, it reloads. The human cost. When money dies, it doesn't vanish evenly. It disappears from the bottom up. The teacher who skips dinner to feed her kids. The nurse whose paycheck shrinks between shifts. The soldier who defends a nation that can't afford to pay him. Inflation isn't just numbers. It's humiliation disguised as policy. In Zimbabwe, engineers traded blueprints for bread. In Venezuela, salaries turned to dust by lunchtime. In Lebanon, bank accounts became museum pieces. No one saves a collapsing currency, but people rebuild around it. In Caracas, neighbors became banks. In Beirut, communities became ledgers. When money failed, trust replaced it. Because the human instinct for exchange is older than the state, older than interest, older than every flag that promised salvation. And in those small acts of barter and solidarity, you can see the same pattern repeating. Collapse breeds community, and scarcity rediscovers value. The system dies from the top down, but recovery always starts at the bottom. The final reckoning. Every empire believes it's the exception, that its money, its markets, its leaders are too sophisticated to fail. But when the story ends, it ends the same way. Not with a crash, with disbelief. ATMs blinking out of service. Markets paused for stability. Politicians smiling through panic. And ordinary people staring at screens that once showed meaning. Because money doesn't die dramatically. It decays silently. Until one morning, everyone realizes the numbers no longer connect to reality. Historians will debate interest rates, policies, geopolitics. But the people living through it will remember something simpler: the feeling of betrayal. That same disbelief Romans felt when silver turned to dust. That same anger Germans felt when wages evaporated overnight. That same confusion Venezuelans felt when zeros lost meaning. Money dies quietly. Empires die pretending. And when it's over, people remember, not the markets, not the charts, but the lies they believed were safe. Truth returns, but not always kindly. Sometimes it rebuilds, sometimes it repeats, sometimes it wears a new uniform with old promises. Value doesn't vanish, it returns home, to hands that create, minds that build, and hearts that refuse comfortable lies. History doesn't repeat, it reopens. The next collapse won't begin with a crash, it'll begin with a truth too uncomfortable to ignore. Subscribe to Wealth Wars, where money decides empires and belief decides collapse.